My parents cornered me in the lobby of my architecture firm, in front of everyone, demanding I sign over my fully paid apartment to my deadbeat brother. They swore they'd destroy my career if I refused. Everyone waited for me to break down in tears, another tragic spectacle of a daughter crushed by the weight of family. Instead, I smiled. I said yes. What they didn't understand, what none of them could see, was that the moment I bowed my head and surrendered was the moment their destruction became inevitable. My gentleness was never a weakness. It was camouflage. 6 o'clock in the evening. The dying sun cut through the city skyline at a low angle, spilling amber light across the polished marble floors of the design firm's lobby. The reception desk had already gone dark for the night. Leo, the security guard, was shuffling toward the side entrance with his thermos tucked under one arm. In another half hour, the whole building would be empty except for the fluorescent hum of overtime lamps and the occasional rustle of blueprints. The end-of-day crowd streamed toward the exits, everyone eager to shake off the exhaustion of back-to-back drafting sessions and disappear into the promise of dinner, of rest, of whatever small comforts waited for them beyond these glass doors. I closed my project folder, drained the last of my coffee, stone cold, hours old, and packed up my laptop with the same quiet efficiency I'd performed 1,000 times before. Nothing about this evening felt different. Nothing about this evening was different, until I was 5 steps from the turnstile and the shouting started. My parents had planted themselves directly in the center of the main thoroughfare, cutting off the flow of foot traffic like a human barricade. My mother stood at the front, one hand gripping my father's jacket sleeve, a detail I would only understand later. She wasn't leaning on him for support. She was making sure he didn't lose his nerve and retreat. Half a step behind her, my father loomed, his face set in that familiar expression of grim authority, like a load-bearing wall that had been standing for so long nobody remembered it was crumbling from the inside. And off to the side, slouched against a pillar with his hands jammed in his pockets and a pair of over-ear headphones draped around his neck, was my younger brother, Jake. His posture radiated the kind of casual entitlement that came from a lifetime of never being told no. For weeks, I had been keeping them at arm's length, shorter calls, vague excuses, a growing distance they must have sensed but couldn't name. This ambush was their response. When guilt and obligation stopped working from a distance, they brought the fight to my doorstep. My colleagues slowed their steps. Some pretended to take phone calls, hovering behind potted ficus trees. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their body language caught between concern and morbid curiosity. Zoe from the structural engineering team had her phone half raised, thumb hovering, debating whether to call security, or maybe just to record whatever was about to unfold. A loose ring of onlookers began to form, amorphous and breathless, the way crowds always coagulate around the promise of someone else's pain. I didn't get a chance to ask why they were here. My mother launched first. Emma Sullivan. Her voice rang out across the lobby, sharp enough to bounce off the 6-meter ceiling and come back as a ghost of itself. She'd calibrated it perfectly, loud enough to stop people in their tracks, not so loud that she'd sound unhinged. I wondered, distantly, how many times she'd rehearsed this in front of the bathroom mirror. Do you have a single shred of conscience left? Jake's about to get engaged and all he needs is one apartment, one decent place to start his life, and you're hoarding that new place you bought like some kind of miser. If you don't agree to transfer the deed today, right now, we are not leaving. We will stay here until you see reason. She paused. A perfectly timed pause, landing right in the gap between her accusation and whatever I might say in my defense. Long enough for the bystanders to digest her version of events, short enough to deny me any window to respond. A few nearby colleagues who didn't know me well began exchanging weighted looks. I could feel their gazes shifting, curiosity hardening into judgment. This was exactly what she wanted. My mother had always understood the mechanics of public opinion better than anyone I'd ever met. Seize the moral high ground first, weaponize the audience's sympathy second, and by the time the accused opens her mouth, she's already lost. My father picked up the baton without missing a beat. His voice was lower than my mother's, rougher, carrying the kind of unquestionable authority that comes from 3 decades of being the undisputed head of a household. We raised you for 20-some years. We scrimped and saved to put you through school, to give you every opportunity, and this is how you repay us. By turning into an ungrateful brat. That apartment goes to Jake. This is not a discussion. If you insist on being stubborn, we will march straight up to your boss's office, to your director, to whoever signs your paychecks, and we will have a very thorough conversation about what kind of daughter stands by while her own family struggles. He landed on the word ungrateful with the full weight of his baritone, and his eyes pinned me in place like a specimen on a corkboard. That word. I'd heard it so many times over the years that it had carved a groove into my brain, a well-worn neural pathway that led straight to guilt. Sophomore year of college, when I'd won a semester abroad scholarship but needed to cover part of the travel costs myself, ungrateful, because Jake was still in high school and needed tutoring money, and how dare I think only of myself. Graduation year, when I'd been offered a position at this very firm and wanted to sign a 3-year contract, ungrateful, because the family wanted me to move back home and take a government job, because a family should be together. Every time he used that word, it was like he was tightening a screw, driving the dead deeper into my bones, one turn at a time. But standing there now, watching his jaw tighten in that familiar way, watching his shoulders cant forward with that practiced air of menace, I felt something I didn't expect. Nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, not even resentment. Just a cool, clinical detachment, the kind you feel when you finally see the pattern behind a magic trick. His micro-expressions were a template he'd been reusing for 20 years. Once you saw the machinery, the fear had nothing left to grip. They knew exactly what they were doing. This job was everything I had built, years of all-nighters over drafting tables, a scholarship I'd begged for on my knees in the principal's office after they'd tried to pull me out of school to work and support Jake's education, 5 years of university funded entirely by grants and 2 part-time jobs while living in a dorm room so small I could touch both walls at once. I'd never asked them for a single cent. And now here they were, in the one place that was supposed to be mine, weaponizing my reputation and my livelihood against me with surgical precision. They'd chosen the peak of rush hour, when the lobby would be at its busiest. They'd chosen the most public venue imaginable. They'd calculated everything. Jake finally pushed himself off the pillar, moving with the slow, unhurried swagger of someone who'd never had to rush for anything in his life. He looked at me the way my mother looked at a restaurant menu, expectant, entitled, faintly bored. His eyes had her exact shape and color, but it was more than genetics. It was the expression. That look of a person who had been pressing buttons on a vending machine his entire life and had never once had a snack fail to drop. Look, sis, let's be real. He punctuated the sentence with a yawn, lifting his arm just high enough to flash a new smartwatch from under his cuff, the one our mother had fundraised for in the family group chat last month, calling it something Jake needs for his new job. Girls get married and move into their husband's place anyway. A house sitting in your name is just wasted equity. Better to put it where it'll actually get used, you know. We're family. What's yours is mine. It's not that complicated. He said this with the flat conviction of someone announcing a law of physics. Not a demand, not a request, a simple statement of how the universe worked. Water flowed downhill. The sun rose in the east. Emma's things belonged to Jake. He didn't even need to work up any real anger. In his experience, anger was unnecessary. Compliance was a foregone conclusion. He just had to wait. I stood there in the middle of that gleaming lobby, facing the three people whose blood ran in my veins, and I waited for the feelings to come. The hurt. The outrage. The sting of betrayal. Anything. But all I felt was a vast, still silence, like a frozen lake under a winter sky. 20-some years of bottomless demands and invisible strings had bled me dry, drop by drop, so gradually I hadn't even noticed the moment the last of my warmth drained away. My breathing was steady. My heart rate was probably flatlining. If someone had hooked me up to a monitor right then, the green line would have looked like a Zen master's meditation readout. Real heartbreak, I realized, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't screaming or sobbing or throwing things against the wall. It was this. The quiet absence of everything you used to feel. The exhaustion of not even being angry anymore. From the outside, the Sullivans were the picture of the modern American family. My parents never missed an opportunity to tell anyone who'd listen that they didn't play favorites, that both their children were equally precious to them, that they'd raised a daughter and a son with the same love and the same standards. I'd believed it once, with the ferocious, desperate belief of a child who needed it to be true. Every Christmas, my mother posted the family photo on Facebook, all four of us around the dining table, her caption always the same, blessed with two wonderful kids. Couldn't ask for more. I was always at the edge of the frame. She never cropped me out, because that would have ruined the symmetry. The likes and heart emojis piled up underneath. Such a beautiful family. You're so lucky. Goals. I grew older, and I started to see the machinery beneath the surface. The most insidious kind of favoritism was never the obvious kind. It wasn't shouting, "You're worthless because you're a girl." It wasn't denying me dinner or taking my door off its hinges or any of the overt cruelties that made for easy narratives. It was subtler, more pervasive, more impossible to pin down. It was 1,000 tiny calibrations, a million microscopic double standards that each meant nothing on their own and everything when stacked together over a lifetime. When Jake messed up, my parents waved it off with a breezy "boys will be boys," and then comforted him for being upset about getting caught. When I made a mistake, I got the lecture, hours of it, about maturity, about responsibility, about being the bigger person, about not letting the family down. I was 12 when Jake shattered my mother's prized vase, the one her own grandmother had given her, the one she dusted by hand every Sunday with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. She patted him on the head and told him not to worry about it, then turned to me as I came into the room and said, "Emma, honey, clean this up for your brother. Make sure he doesn't cut his feet." The same year, I brought home a 93 on a history test, and my father spent the entire evening explaining to me, in excruciating detail, why second place was just a prettier word for failure. Jake folded the test paper into a paper airplane and threw it across the living room. Nobody stopped him. When Jake mentioned something he wanted, my parents found a way to get it: limited edition sneakers in middle school, a gaming PC in high school, a car when he said he didn't want to take the bus like a loser. My father handed over the keys and the title to his own 3-year-old sedan without a moment's hesitation. But every time I summoned the courage to ask for something I needed, the answer was always the same, delivered in the patient, loving tone of someone explaining a hard truth to a child: good girls don't ask for things. Good girls know how to be content. I remember being 13, sitting at the dinner table for a full week trying to work up the nerve to mention the school summer trip to Washington, D.C., $200, 3 days, a chance to see the Smithsonian. When I finally whispered it out, my mother's fork paused mid-air. My father set down his glass and fixed me with that look, the one that meant a lesson was coming. "Things are tight right now, sweetheart. Jake's starting middle school and he needs new everything. You're the older one. You understand. I nodded, balled up the permission slip I'd already filled out, and buried it at the bottom of the kitchen trash can where no one would see. Later that summer, I found out from Jake that our father had spent $900 on the latest gaming console, for Jake, of course, because he'd had a tough school year and deserved something nice. That was when I learned to translate. I want became it's okay. Disappointment got folded into a smile. Hope got dialed down to the lowest possible setting, because hope was just a setup for heartbreak, and I was so tired of being heartbroken. This was the bargain I made with myself, alone in my bedroom at night while the rest of the house slept. If I never expected anything, I could never be disappointed. It was the only protection I had. And still, for years, I kept making excuses for them. I told myself my parents just weren't good with words. That Jake was immature but he'd grow out of it. That if I could just be good enough, responsible enough, generous enough, successful enough, someday they would look at me the way they looked at him. I twisted myself into every shape I thought they might approve of. I never asked for help. After I started working, I sent money home every month without fail, even when it meant eating rice and canned soup for the last week of the pay cycle. I absorbed everyone's moods, smoothed over every conflict, apologized for things that weren't my fault. I shrank and shrank and shrank, thinking that if I could just get small enough, invisible enough, undemanding enough, I would finally be worthy of the love I'd been begging for since I was old enough to understand that love was something you had to earn. I genuinely believed that if I was obedient enough, excellent enough, selfless enough, someday I would receive the equal treatment I had been chasing my entire life. The delusion shattered last month. On my birthday. I still remember every detail of that dinner with the kind of vivid, forensic clarity that only comes when something inside you is in the process of dying. I'd spent 2 weeks planning it, a family dinner at my parents' house, the kind of warm, sitcom family gathering I'd been craving since childhood. I'd tracked down my mother's favorite organic skincare set, the one she'd mentioned offhand 6 months ago. I'd found a wellness package for my father with a comprehensive health screening, since he'd been complaining about his cholesterol. Even though money was tight, I just closed on the apartment and my savings account was a ghost town. I'd still bought Jake the noise-canceling headphones he'd been hinting about for months. Top of the line. $350 plus tax. I'd turned down overtime shifts and a friend's dinner invitation, cleared my entire schedule, and showed up at my parents' doorstep with an armful of presents and a bouquet of flowers for my mother. She took them, smiled, and set them on the shoe cabinet in the hallway without even looking for a vase. For about 45 minutes, things felt almost normal. My parents made a show of thanking me for the gifts, and my mother actually put her hand on my shoulder and told me I was so thoughtful. My Aunt Carol, who'd come for dinner, said something about how daughters were just naturally more caring than sons. My mother nodded. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She picked up her fork, selected a piece of braised short rib from the platter, and placed it in my bowl. The meat was perfectly caramelized, glistening with sauce, and for one mortifying second I felt my eyes get hot. I had to look down and shovel rice into my mouth to keep from crying. I remember thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe all the years of swallowing my feelings had finally paid off. Maybe I'd earned it. That was the bait. That was the moment the trap closed. Jake looked up from his phone, still chewing, and said through a mouthful of food, "Oh yeah, all my buddies just upgraded to those new gaming laptops, the ones with the RTX graphics. My old rig is basically a potato at this point. I'm like 1,500 short if I want to get the good one." He didn't even look at me when he said it. Not because he was afraid to, because he didn't need to. In his world, this wasn't a request directed at anyone in particular. It was just a fact he was announcing to the room, confident that the machinery would handle the rest. I waited for my parents to do the reasonable thing. To suggest he save up. To point out that he'd just gotten a new laptop 2 months ago, and a new phone the month before that. To maybe, just once, apply the same standards to their son that they'd been applying to their daughter for a quarter of a century. My mother smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with a fondness I'd never seen her direct at me, and dropped the words like she was commenting on the weather. "Oh, that's easy. Your sister makes good money and she doesn't have many expenses. She can spot you the difference. No big deal. No big deal." The same cadence she'd used to say, "Pass the salt," or "Looks like rain." She wasn't commanding me. She wasn't even really asking me. She was stating a fact, as obvious and incontestable as gravity. Emma's money was Jake's money. Emma's labor was Jake's leisure. Emma's hunger was Jake's feast. This wasn't a family discussion. It was a law of nature, and she was just the messenger. I set down my fork. The motion was very quiet. The metal tines made almost no sound against the ceramic rest. Actually, things are kind of tight for me right now. I just closed on the apartment and I need to keep a cushion for incidentals. I kept my voice light, almost apologetic. I don't think I can swing it this time. The temperature at the table dropped 20 degrees in 2 seconds. My mother's hand froze over the serving dish, her smile crystallizing into something brittle and unfamiliar. My Aunt Patricia, who'd been mid-sentence about her son's college applications, closed her mouth and suddenly became deeply fascinated by the pattern on her napkin. Even my Uncle Bill, who was famously oblivious to subtext, picked up on the shift and started studying the ceiling like it held the secrets of the universe. My father set down his glass with the deliberate heaviness I'd learned to dread before I'd learned to read. The base of the glass hit the table with a thick, resonant thud, the kind of sound a judge's gavel makes right before the sentence comes down. "Emma." His voice had dropped into that register of weary, paternal disappointment that he'd been perfecting since I was old enough to disappoint him. "You're several years older than your brother. You're supposed to be the mature one. We're a family. Families don't keep spreadsheets. Being a big sister means helping out, that's just how it works. Keeping score all the time, nickel-and-diming your own flesh and blood, that's not who we raised you to be." And then Jake, emboldened by the backup, chimed in with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told that cruelty had consequences. "Mom and Dad always said they'd treat us the same. Just skip a few shopping trips or whatever. It's $1,500, not a kidney. God, why are you being so stingy?" I sat there, the half-chewed bite of short rib turning to ash in my mouth, and something clicked. Not broke. Not shattered. Not the dramatic, cinematic breakdown I'd imagined 1,000 times. It was quieter than that. Cleaner. The pieces just stopped fitting together. 20-some years of confusion, of self-doubt, of twisting myself into knots trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution, and suddenly I could see the whole picture, laid out in brutal, undeniable clarity. Every time they said, "We treat you equally," what they actually meant was, "We hold you to completely different standards, and we call it equality so we don't have to feel guilty about it." Every time they said, "Family helps family," what they actually meant was, "Emma helps Jake." The equation only flowed one direction, and nobody had ever intended for it to flow the other way. Every time they said, "We're so proud of our 2 wonderful children," what they actually meant was, "We're proud of Emma for sacrificing herself, and we're proud of Jake for existing." The equal treatment they never stopped boasting about was the most elaborate con I'd ever been subjected to. Jake, the golden child, reaped every benefit without lifting a finger. I, the dutiful daughter, paid every cost without receiving a shred of what I'd been promised. When I bled myself dry to subsidize the family, I was the perfect, filial daughter, held up as an example for all the relatives to admire. The moment I voiced even the faintest objection, I was selfish, cold, ungrateful, all the labels they'd kept holstered and ready, waiting for the day I finally stopped performing. They collected praise from the outside world for being fair and loving parents, while behind closed doors, they fed on my one-sided devotion like parasites too comfortable to notice they were killing the host. And I, idiot that I was, had spent my entire adult life helping them gaslight me, scrambling to rationalize their cruelty, running myself ragged trying to prove I was worthy of love that was never, ever coming. The cruelest part wasn't that I'd been losing. The cruelest part was that I'd been playing a game that was rigged from the start, and I'd convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I just gave more, if I just made myself small enough and quiet enough and convenient enough, one day the rules would change. One day they'd see me. One day I'd be enough. This wasn't family. This was a hostage situation where I'd fallen in love with my captors. That night, after the dinner ended and the strained goodbyes were said, I went back to my rental apartment and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything or scream into a pillow or do any of the cathartic, movie scene things that people are supposed to do when their world falls apart. I just sat on the edge of my bed, still in my coat, and watched the city lights blink out one by one through the window. The heating unit rattled in the corner. The fridge hummed its tired, familiar hum. The convenience store on the corner stayed lit all night, its cold white fluorescence cutting through the blinds and throwing long, pale stripes across the floor like the bars of a cell. I thought about the summer camp permission slip I'd buried in the trash when I was 13. I thought about the college scholarship I'd almost turned down because they'd made me feel guilty for wanting to leave. I thought about every paycheck I'd split with them, every loan to Jake that was never repaid, every time I'd swallowed my feelings because expressing them would make me difficult. I thought about the way my mother had set those flowers on the shoe cabinet without even looking at them, and the way I'd still, after everything, felt a surge of hope when she put that piece of meat in my bowl. I thought about how pathetic that hope was, and how hard I'd worked to keep it alive against all evidence, and how much of my life I'd spent watering a dead plant and calling it faith. Sometime around 4 a.m, the breakfast place across the street turned on its lights. Steam began rising from the kitchen vents, white and ghostly in the pre-dawn air. It looked exactly like the steam that used to rise from my mother's stove when I was small, when she'd let me stand on a step stool beside her and watch her make breakfast. I let myself feel the ache of that memory for exactly 3 seconds, a sharp, nostalgic pang that lodged somewhere behind my sternum, and then I stood up, walked to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. The person in the mirror had tangled hair and dark circles under her eyes. But her eyes were dry. Not red-rimmed, not puffy, not glistening with unshed tears. Just dry, and very, very still. Like a lake after the ice has frozen solid. I finally understood. It wasn't me being oversensitive. It wasn't me imagining things. There had never been fairness in this family, and there never would be. The most terrifying form of favoritism isn't the kind that announces itself, it's the kind that wears a mask of equity while demanding you participate in your own slow destruction. They didn't need to take anything from me by force. They trained me to hand it over willingly, with a smile, and call it love. That was the night my heart died. Not with a bang, with a quiet, final exhalation, the way a candle gives up its last wisp of smoke and goes dark. I stopped craving the approval I was never going to get. I stopped second-guessing my own perceptions. I stopped turning myself inside out trying to earn a place at a table where no seat had ever been set for me. On the outside, nothing changed. I was still the same Emma Sullivan everyone knew, agreeable, reliable, unassuming, the one who always said yes. I called my parents at the usual intervals. I responded to messages in the family group chat with the same polite cheerfulness. I showed up for Sunday dinners and helped with the dishes. The only difference was invisible to everyone but me. The soft, vulnerable core I'd spent 20-some years protecting had finally calcified into something cold and impenetrable. In its place was a new kind of clarity, precise and surgical, the emotional equivalent of a CAD program rendering every interaction in clean, measurable vectors. I began to prepare. Methodically. Patiently. I archived every text message, every voicemail, every bank transfer receipt. I saved screenshots of the family group chat where my sacrifices were praised and my boundaries were mocked. I recorded conversations, legally, carefully, with the quiet diligence of someone building a case that might never need to be made but would be ironclad if it did. I consulted a lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus Webb who specialized in family asset disputes, and I laid out the entire history for him in a 3-hour meeting that left him shaking his head. "I've seen some lopsided family dynamics," he said, flipping through my folder of documentation, "but this is something else. Legally speaking, you're in a very strong position if you decide to act. Ethically speaking," he paused and looked at me over his glasses, "you've already given them more than anyone could reasonably ask." I didn't act. Not yet. A predator doesn't chase its prey across open ground. It waits, camouflaged and motionless, for the prey to deliver itself. I knew my family. I knew their appetites, their blind spots, their unshakable conviction that the daughter they'd spent 2 decades molding would never, could never, turn on them. They would come for the biggest thing I had eventually. Greed was a gravity well, and they were already in its pull. All I had to do was wait. The prey's greatest weakness is believing it's the hunter. And today, they had come. They'd come to my workplace, in front of everyone I respected and admired, and they'd reached for the one thing I had left, the apartment I'd poured every dollar and every sleepless night of my adult life into acquiring. They'd come faster than I'd predicted and with less pretense than I'd imagined possible. Not even a thin veneer of negotiation. Not even the courtesy of asking in private. They'd chosen maximum humiliation, maximum pressure, maximum public leverage. Good. That made it easier. I raised my eyes and swept my gaze across the 3 of them, my sputtering mother, my glowering father, my smirking brother, and felt nothing at all. In the peripheral vision of the horrified, pitying colleagues who ringed us like spectators at an execution, I let the corners of my mouth lift. That smile. I knew it well. I'd worn it 1,000 times before, every time I'd been asked to be the bigger person, every time I'd swallowed my pride and said, "Of course, I understand," every time I'd bled quietly into my palms and then opened them to show they were empty and clean. But this time, it meant something completely different. "Okay." My voice came out clear and even, carrying across the lobby with the unremarkable tone I might use to approve a minor change order on a set of blueprints. "I'll sign the apartment over to Jake. We can start the paperwork now." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant hum of the office printer seemed to falter. My parents froze in place like malfunctioning animatronics, my mother's mouth still half open around the accusation she'd been winding up to deliver, my father's body locked in its forward-leaning intimidation stance, his fists half clenched and suspended at his sides. Jake's smirk evaporated. His hands came out of his pockets. His pupils contracted, just slightly, in the way that people's do when their brain is scrambling to process an outcome it never simulated. They had run through every possible scenario in their heads. Me crying. Me arguing. Me trying to negotiate. Me crumbling under the pressure and eventually, grudgingly, giving in after they'd extracted enough pain to make the victory satisfying. They had prepared for resistance. They had not prepared for this. The shock lasted maybe 3 seconds before it was steamrolled by a tidal wave of undisguised euphoria. My mother's expression flipped like a switch, the hard-edged fury of a moment ago melting into something cloying and saccharine, a parody of maternal warmth. She actually reached for my hands. I knew it. I knew our Emma was the most sensible girl in the world. You never let us down, sweetheart. You've always been so good to your little brother. Jake's smirk reassembled itself, wider this time, tinged with the particular arrogance of someone who just had his worldview validated. Of course she said yes. Why wouldn't she say yes? The apartment had always been his, really. He'd just been waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the truth. He was already typing on his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. I caught a glimpse of the chat window. The contact was saved as wifey, and the message was just a string of grinning emojis. The colleagues around us murmured and dispersed, their expressions a mix of pity and vicarious defeat. Zoe from Structural had actual tears in her eyes. She bit her lip and shot me a look that was equal parts sympathy and frustration, the kind of look you give someone you care about when they're making a mistake you can't save them from. Margaret from admin shook her head and walked away, her heels striking the marble with more force than strictly necessary. Leo the security guard had circled back at some point and was standing near the entrance, his thermos still uncapped, his weathered face creased with something that looked a lot like disappointment. None of them understood. None of them could see beneath the surface of my submission to the machinery turning underneath. Good. That meant I'd done it right. I tilted my head and softened my voice, slipping into the role of the helpful, considerate daughter who was already thinking ahead to the next practical concern. Transferring the apartment is the easy part. But we should also think about all the other expenses. The renovation, the wedding deposits, the catering, the honeymoon. Jake's going to need cash, and a lot of it. I've put everything I had into the down payment on this place. There's nothing left in my accounts to help with the rest. The joy on their faces flickered, just for a moment. Jake's typing paused. My father's hand drifted toward his jacket pocket, the one with the pack of cigarettes he always reached for when he was doing mental math. They all turned to me, waiting, their eyes holding the same expression I'd seen 1,000 times before. Not the anger they directed at the daughter who said no, but the dependency they directed at the daughter who could fix things. I let the silence breathe for exactly the right number of seconds before I offered them the rope. I've been thinking about this, actually. I kept my voice casual, almost musing, as if the idea was just occurring to me. There's a way to handle it that's pretty straightforward. Mom and Dad still own the old house free and clear, right? That property's in a great location, the bank would appraise it high. If we use it as collateral for a short-term loan, we could probably pull out about $45,000. That would cover everything Jake needs for the wedding and then some. The approval would be fast, the interest would be manageable, and honestly, it's the most efficient option all around. I said efficient deliberately. Not cheapest. Not safest. Efficient. It was a word that appealed to my father's vanity and my mother's impatience, a word that made the whole thing sound like a smart financial move instead of what it actually was. They bit. Of course they bit. In their world, where Jake's happiness was the family's single largest line item, leveraging the roof over their heads for his wedding was not a sacrifice, it was an obvious, unremarkable transaction. My mother nodded first, and then my father, after a hesitation that lasted no more than 3 seconds, a flicker of doubt that was immediately buried under 30 years of conditioning that Emma's ideas were always sound, Emma's help was always reliable, Emma's smile always meant everything was under control. Jake perked up at the words, $45,000, his eyes lighting up with a hunger that made his earlier greed for the apartment look like mild enthusiasm. I knew him too well. A property he couldn't liquidate was an abstraction. $45,000 in a checking account, that was real. That was motorcycles and bachelor parties and the kind of wedding that would make his friends jealous. That was dopamine on tap. The fact that the loan came due in 3 months. Irrelevant. 3 months was forever. 3 months was practically never. Jake had never planned more than 3 days ahead in his life. I volunteered to handle all the paperwork. You guys just need to show up and sign. I'll take care of the rest, it's the kind of thing I do at work all the time. My mother beamed. My father clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture he hadn't made in years, and the three of them strode out of the lobby with the buoyant, victorious energy of an army that had just sacked a city without a fight. My mother paused at the revolving door and turned back to call out, "Come for dinner this weekend, sweetheart. I'll make your favorite soup." Her voice was dripping with a sweetness so thick and cloying it could have been poured over pancakes. 10 minutes earlier, she'd been shrieking about my lack of conscience in front of 24 strangers. The whiplash would have given anyone else vertigo. I smiled and waved. Then I bent down, picked up the pack of cigarettes that had fallen from my father's pocket during his grand performance, and dropped it neatly into the trash. The motion gave me about 3 seconds to scan the room, to confirm the expressions on my colleagues' faces, the pity, the head shakes, the unspoken verdict that Emma Sullivan was the world's biggest doormat, and to confirm that my performance had no cracks. When I straightened up, Zoe was standing there with red-rimmed eyes. "Emma." She opened her mouth, closed it, and finally just squeezed my arm and walked toward the elevator without finishing the sentence. I stood alone in the empty lobby, the last of the sunset bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows and pooling on the marble like watered-down wine. Somewhere in the building, a ventilation system hummed its low, constant note. The cleaning crew would be arriving soon. The night security shift would be clocking in. The ordinary machinery of the building would continue turning, indifferent to the small human drama that had just played out in its atrium. I felt nothing. No sadness. No anger. No vindication. No, that wasn't quite true. I felt something. A single, crystalline thread of emotion, so fine I almost missed it. Relief. Over the next 2 days, I threw myself into the logistics with an efficiency that made my parents call me twice to tell me how impressive and dependable I was. I shuttled between the title office and the bank, assembling documents, expediting processes, signing forms in triplicate. At the title transfer appointment, my mother poured hot water from her thermos into a paper cup and handed it to me while we waited for our number to be called. "Here, sweetie, you've been running around all morning." The water was the perfect temperature, hot enough to warm my hands, not hot enough to burn. She remembered I didn't drink cold water. For half a second, I felt a flicker of something old and tender and dangerous, and then I looked at her face and saw the calculation still running behind her eyes, the faint, satisfied smugness of a negotiator who'd closed the deal of a lifetime for the price of a paper cup of water, and the flicker died. I took the cup. "Thanks, Mom." In 48 hours, everything was done. The deed to my fully paid apartment was transferred to Jake Sullivan, free and clear. The mortgage on my parents' house was registered, the lien perfected. And $45,000, processed not as a standard home equity line with a 15-year repayment schedule, but as a short-term hard money bridge loan with a 90-day maturity and a balloon payment of the entire principal, landed in Jake Sullivan's personal checking account. At the bank, before they signed, I spread the contract across the table and walked them through every highlighted clause. My finger traced the repayment terms. I read the default provisions aloud, slowly, looking each of them in the eye. This isn't a conventional mortgage. It's a bridge loan, 90 days, full balance due at maturity. If it's not paid on time, the lender can charge default interest that compounds every day, and they have the right to initiate foreclosure on the collateral property. That means the house. It also means all 3 borrowers go onto the credit default registry, which will make it nearly impossible to get any kind of loan or credit card for years. Please make sure you understand this before you sign. My father waved his hand. Yes, we get it. 90 days. Jake will have all the wedding cash gifts by then, and we'll figure out the rest. It's fine. He grabbed the pen and scrawled his signature with the impatient flourish of a man who'd been mildly inconvenienced by having to read. My mother didn't even open her copy. She flipped straight to the signature page and signed. Jake signed last, and he did it one-handed while scrolling through a live stream on his phone with the other. The host was yelling something about a flash sale. Jake's signature came out as an illegible squiggle, the pen barely making contact with the paper. He rolled the contract copy into a tube and stuffed it into his jacket pocket, where it joined a tangle of motorcycle keys and a handful of wedding favor samples. They walked out of the bank into the bright autumn afternoon, chattering about flower arrangements and DJ options, and squeezed into Jake's car, the one our father had signed over to him, the one Jake was still making payments on, the one that backfired twice before peeling out of the parking lot and disappearing into traffic. My phone buzzed. My mother, via voice message, "Don't forget dinner this weekend, sweetheart. I'm making your favorite soup." That was the second time she'd made that promise in 3 days. The last time she'd actually followed through on it, I was 9 years old. I deleted the message. My fingers brushed against something in my pocket, a crumpled pack of cigarettes. My father's. He dropped it in the lobby during his performance and never noticed it was gone. A man who'd smoked for 40 years and couldn't keep track of what was in his own pockets wasn't going to notice the shift in his daughter's eyes. I tossed the pack in the trash outside the bank and walked toward the subway entrance. I had a few things to take care of over the next 3 months. A new apartment to find, since mine now legally belonged to someone else. A resume to update, just in case. Some final documents to sign with Marcus Webb. And somewhere in there, I decided I was going to buy myself flowers. Not for any reason. Not to celebrate. Just because I wanted to, and I could, and there was no one left in my life who would tell me I didn't deserve them. That feeling settling into my bones as I descended the subway stairs, that quiet, unfamiliar lightness, I was pretty sure there was a word for it. Oh, right. Freedom. The Sullivan family erupted into celebration. The group chat, which had been quiet for months except for my mother's daily inspirational quote spam, lit up with a frenzy of congratulatory messages that made my college graduation and my job offer announcements look like obituaries. Aunt Carol posted a 9-photo grid of Jake's housewarming party, the new apartment, the one I'd bought with years of overtime and sacrifice, its freshly painted walls already dotted with cigarette burns and scuff marks from Jake's friend's shoes. The caption read, "So proud of Jake. New house, new chapter, big things ahead." My mother responded with a voice message, her tone practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. "That's our Emma for you," she said. Never been a day of trouble in her life. Just the sweetest, most dependable girl. The relatives piled on. "You raised them right," someone said. "This is what family is all about," said someone else. My Aunt Patricia sent me a private message that was 2 full minutes of rambling about how I'd done the right thing, and how girls who fight with their brothers always regret it later, followed by an offer to set me up with a very nice young man from her church. I didn't reply. I took a screenshot and filed it in the encrypted folder with all the others. Jake, meanwhile, was on a spending spree that he documented with the meticulous dedication of a lifestyle influencer. Week 1, a brand new motorcycle, top of the line, $19,000 plus tax and delivery. He posted a video of himself revving the engine in the parking lot, the caption reading, "Pre-wedding gift to myself." The comments flooded in, fire emojis, "Bro, that's sick, you're living the dream." Week 2, a diamond engagement ring that probably cost more than my first car, followed by a deposit invoice for a destination wedding photo shoot in the Caribbean. Week 3, a contract with the most expensive wedding planner in the tri-state area, the kind who charged a 5-figure retainer just to answer your emails. He put a down payment on a boat. He booked a honeymoon suite in Bora Bora. He ordered custom suits for himself and 6 groomsmen. Every receipt, every invoice, every flashy purchase drained the $45,000 loan balance like a bathtub with the plug pulled. My mother called me occasionally, her voice carrying a faint note of concern that she was clearly trying to suppress. "Jake's spending is a little enthusiastic," she'd say, and then in the same breath, "But you know how boys are. He's just excited. It's his big day. Can you come over this weekend and help with the place cards? Your handwriting is so much nicer than his." "Of course," I said. After I hung up, I opened the encrypted folder and added the call recording. File name, call_mom_Jake_overspending_confirmed_date. 90 days. I'd circled the date on my calendar in red ink, a small, silent clock face ticking away in the corner of my screen. But until that day arrived, the Sullivan household floated on a bubble of borrowed bliss, utterly oblivious to the countdown winding towards 0. Midway through the 3rd month, with 15 days left on the clock, Jake's wedding preparations entered their final, feverish stage. He'd booked the most expensive hotel ballroom in the city for the reception, 200 guests, open bar, plated 5-course dinner. The per-head cost was absurd. My mother, during one of the planning sessions at the old house, had ventured a quiet, "Do we really need the lobster option?" and Jake had shut her down with the irrefutable logic of a groom who'd never been denied anything in his life. "It's my wedding. I'm only doing this once. You want me to look cheap in front of everyone we know?" My father, who'd been nursing a bourbon at the head of the table, nodded his agreement. "The boy's right. Some things you don't skimp on." My mother didn't bring it up again. She just went back to peeling shrimp for Jake's plate, the discarded shells piling up beside his bowl like a tiny monument to everything I'd never gotten. I sat at the far end of the table, eating my soup in silence. It was a clear broth, delicately flavored, a few specks of green onion floating on the surface like scattered thoughts. I stared at my own wavering reflection in the bowl and thought, Jake was right about one thing. Some people only get married once. Other people only get one chance to pay their debts. And the second kind of once usually lasts a lot longer than the first. 7 days before the due date, the bank's automated system sent the first payment reminder. It was a Saturday. Jake was at the hotel doing a walkthrough of the ceremony setup. My father forwarded the text to me with a one-line message. "Bank sent something about a payment. Take a look and handle it." The text from the bank was polite and bureaucratic and unmistakably clear. "Dear customer, your loan balance of $45,000 plus accrued interest will be due in full in 7 days. Please ensure sufficient funds are available in your designated account. Late payments are subject to daily compounding penalties and will be reported to all major credit bureaus." Every word of that message was plain English, but my father clearly hadn't read past the first line. In his mental model of the universe, financial complications were Emma's department. Emma handled things. Emma always handled things. The path dependency of 20-some years meant that the idea of simply reading the text himself and understanding its implications didn't even occur to him. I typed back 4 words, "I'll look into it." I didn't explain. I didn't warn. I didn't walk them through the fine print the way I had at the bank 3 months earlier. From a legal standpoint, I had already done everything required of me and more. I'd read the contract aloud. I'd emphasize the repayment deadline. I'd explained the default penalties in plain, unambiguous language while a bank officer watched and the security cameras rolled. The documentation was immaculate. The rest of the conversation would be conducted not by me, but by the bank, in a voice far louder and far less forgiving than mine. The due date fell on a Saturday, exactly 1 week before Jake's wedding. The whole family had gathered at my parents' house for a final coordination meeting. The coffee table was buried under seating charts, place card mock-ups, ribbon samples, and a 3-ring binder full of vendor contracts. My mother and a squadron of aunts were locked in an intense debate about the relative merits of different napkin folding techniques, a discussion that had been going on for 20 minutes and showed no signs of resolution. Jake was sprawled on the couch, playing some shooter game on his phone, a lollipop stick jutting from the corner of his mouth. Every few minutes he'd glance up, say, "Whatever, just pick one," and go back to his game. Under the coffee table, half hidden by the tablecloth, were several new shoeboxes, limited edition sneakers, the kind that cost more per pair than most people spent on a month's groceries. My father was on the back patio, phone pressed to his ear. Then his voice detonated through the house. "What? What do you mean, past due? What collateral?" The glass door slid open with a bang, and he stumbled inside, his face cycling through colors like a bruise blooming in fast forward, red, purple, a sickly gray-white that I'd never seen on him before. His hand, the one holding the phone, was shaking so hard the device rattled against his ear. The room went silent, the way a forest goes quiet right before a storm hits. My mother stood up from the dining table, still wearing her apron, still clutching the seating chart she'd been annotating. "Robert, what's happening? Who's on the phone?" My father collapsed onto the couch, narrowly missing Jake's outstretched legs. Jake's phone tumbled from his hands and hit the hardwood floor, the game emitting a long, mournful death sound effect as his character bled out on screen. On the other end of the line, some unfortunate bank representative was calmly, professionally, and implacably reading out the consequences. The penalty interest, compounding daily. The acceleration clause, making the entire balance due immediately. The notice of default, already filed. The foreclosure referral, already in process. The credit report impact, applying to every single borrower whose signature appeared on the loan documents, which meant my father, my mother, and my brother. No more loans. No more credit cards. Frozen accounts. A lien on their property. And, if the balance wasn't resolved within the statutory window, a foreclosure sale of the collateral, the house they'd lived in for 35 years. The house. The house where my mother still kept my childhood height marks penciled on the hallway wall. The house where Jake had smashed a family heirloom and been comforted for his trouble. The house I'd spent my entire youth trying to be good enough to deserve. My mother's seating chart drifted to the floor. Jake's lollipop fell out of his open mouth and stuck to the leather couch cushion, a sticky pink wound against the brown. And me. I sat in the armchair in the corner, shelling pistachios into a small ceramic bowl. My fingers were steady. My breathing was even. The pile of shells in the bowl had formed a neat, satisfying mound, each one cracked cleanly in half. 3 pairs of eyes swiveled toward me. My mother spoke first, her voice still carrying that habitual, honeyed tone of the past 3 months, though a tremor had crept in around the edges. "Emma, honey, I think the bank made a mistake. This wasn't supposed to be one of those short-term things, was it? You said it was a standard loan. Just call them and straighten it out, okay? Tell them there's been a misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding. I set down the pistachio I'd been holding and wiped my fingers on a napkin, one at a time, unhurried. Then I looked up and met their eyes. My voice came out the same way it always did in project meetings, level, precise, unhurried. Page 2, Clause 7. The loan term is 90 days, with a single balloon payment of the full principal plus interest due at maturity. I read this clause to the three of you, word for word, at the bank before you signed. The bank officer witnessed it. The security footage recorded it. Silence. Thick and absolute, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Then my father exploded to his feet. His face had gone from gray to a deep, congested purple, the veins at his temples bulging against his skin like cords under tension. When he pointed at me, his whole arm was trembling. You planned this. You knew exactly what you were doing. What kind of monster does this to her own family? His voice was louder than I'd ever heard it. The glassware on the coffee table vibrated. Once, a long time ago, that voice had been the most terrifying sound in my world. It had the power to turn my knees to water, to make me stammer apologies for things I hadn't even done, to send me scrambling to fix whatever I'd broken just to make the shouting stop. That fear had been wired into my nervous system before I was old enough to tie my own shoes. It wasn't rational. It wasn't chosen. It was a reflex, as automatic as flinching from a flame. But standing there, watching his face contort and his fists clench and his whole body shake with an anger he no longer had the power to enforce, I realized something remarkable. The reflex was gone. The wire had been cut. 20-some years of conditioning, and somewhere in the past 3 months, my body had simply unlearned it. I felt no fear. No guilt. No urge to apologize. Just a strange, detached clarity, the kind you feel when you look at an old photograph of yourself and realize you don't recognize the person in it anymore. Dad. I rose slowly from the armchair, reaching into my bag as I did so, and placed a neatly bound document on the coffee table, right on top of the seating chart and the ribbon samples and the wreckage of all their careful plans. It was a full copy of the loan agreement, the critical clauses highlighted in fluorescent yellow, annotated with sticky notes in my precise, architectural handwriting. The bank stamp was on the cover page. The date was printed clearly in the footer. The loan is officially in default as of approximately 1 hour ago. You still have time to contact the bank and negotiate a payment plan, assuming you can come up with $45,000 in the next few business days. Otherwise, the penalties will keep accruing, the foreclosure proceedings will move forward, and the house will be sold at auction to satisfy the debt. $45,000. Jake's voice cracked as he scrambled upright on the couch, his face draining of color. He looked, for the first time in his life, genuinely terrified, not the performative tantrum terror of someone who'd learned that fear was a useful tool for getting what he wanted, but the real thing. The kind of fear that comes from finally, catastrophically, realizing that actions have consequences. I spent all of that. The bike, the ring, the wedding deposits, the boat, the honeymoon, there's maybe, like, $3,000 left in my account. Why didn't you tell me it was due so soon? You set me up. You wanted this to happen. He took a step toward me, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The relatives in the room edged backward. No one moved to stop him, not because they didn't want to, but because, I suspected, they were all waiting to see what would happen next. I looked at him. 3 months ago, he'd leaned against a pillar in my office lobby and drawled, "What's yours is mine," like it was the most obvious truth in the world. Now he was shrieking at me, red-faced and shaking, because it turned out that what was mine had never really been his to begin with, and the bill for his assumption had just come due. Jake. My voice was gentle. So gentle. The kind of gentle that wraps around a blade so smoothly you don't feel the cut until you're already bleeding. I told you. You just didn't listen. My mother's face crumpled. The tears came immediately, streaming down her cheeks in dark rivulets of mascara, and her shoulders began to heave with the same choked, stuttering sobs I'd been hearing my entire life. That sound. That specific, heart-rending sound. It was the most effective weapon in her arsenal, and she knew it. Every time she'd deployed it in the past, I'd folded within seconds, apologizing, backtracking, reaching for my checkbook, doing whatever it took to make the crying stop. She'd trained me like a lab rat, press the lever, deliver the pellet. The sound of her tears, and Emma would fix everything. But today, I just stood there, and let her cry. Emma. Her voice was a wrecked, wet whisper. She reached for me with both hands, her fingers trembling, the same hands that had braided my hair when I was small and pressed a cool cloth to my forehead when I had a fever and signed away my birthright without a second thought. Baby, please. Please help your brother. Help this family. You've always been the good one. The one who never lets us down. You've always been so good to your little brother. Please. Isn't there something you can do? The good one. I repeated the phrase slowly, testing its weight on my tongue. The one who never lets you down. I'd been carrying that title for 20-some years. It was supposed to be a badge of honor. It had always been a leash. Every time they called me the good one, what they really meant was, the one who will say yes. The one who will absorb the cost. The one who will bleed quietly and never complain. The one we don't have to worry about, because we've trained her to worry about herself so we don't have to. Mom. I shouldered my bag, the strap settling into the familiar groove on my shoulder, and looked down at her tear-streaked, bewildered face. You've got it wrong. I was never the good one. I was the only one you demanded goodness from. Those are two very different things. I walked to the front door. The living room behind me was a diorama of devastation. My father, purple-faced and shaking, his phone lying cracked on the floor where he'd hurled it. My mother, collapsed into the armchair I'd just vacated, her sobs escalating into something raw and uncontrolled. Jake, standing in the middle of the room with his fists still clenched and his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on a dock, tears finally spilling down his cheeks, not the manipulative tears of a child who'd learned to weaponize emotion, but the real, ugly, frightened tears of an adult who'd just discovered that the world didn't revolve around him after all. The relatives, frozen in a loose semicircle around the carnage, their faces cycling through shock, judgment, and the unmistakable discomfort of people who'd spent years praising the family's harmony, and were now watching it detonate in real time. I pulled open the door. Emma! Jake's voice cracked into a full-throated scream behind me. Don't you dare walk away. Fix this. If you walk out that door, you're not my sister anymore. You're dead to this family. Dead. I stopped. My hand rested on the doorknob, the cool metal anchoring me to the present. Behind me, I felt the room hold its breath. The hope was almost palpable, a sudden, desperate surge of it, radiating from every person in that house. They thought he'd done it. They thought he'd found the magic words. The nuclear option. The threat of exile. Because in their world, a woman without a family was pitiable, incomplete, a failure. Because in their world, Emma had always come crawling back. I turned my head and looked at my brother one last time. His chest was heaving. His face was blotchy with tears and rage. He looked, in that moment, exactly like our mother, not just in the shape of his features, but in the desperate, uncomprehending entitlement of his expression. He still believed. After everything, he still believed that the old rules applied. That the old Emma would fold. That the word family was a magic spell that would bring me to my knees. I smiled at him. It was the same smile I'd worn in the design firm lobby, mild, agreeable, utterly unreadable. "You're right, Jake." My voice was light and soft, like a leaf settling onto still water. "This isn't my home anymore. And you're not my family. You never were." I stepped through the doorway and pulled the door shut behind me. The sounds that erupted on the other side were muffled by the heavy oak, but I heard them anyway, my mother's wailing, my father's bellowing, Jake's screaming dissolving into something that was half rage and half terrified sobbing, the relatives' voices rising over each other in a cacophony of shock and recrimination. It sounded like the end of something. It sounded like a dam breaking. It sounded, I realized with a strange, distant wonder, like freedom. The lock clicked into place with a solid, final thud. The hallway light flickered on, triggered by the motion sensor, casting a warm amber glow across the familiar walls. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, and let my eyes trace the old markings on the wallpaper, the pencil lines my mother had drawn to track my height, from 3 feet to 4 to 5, stopping abruptly at 5'4", the last measurement taken when I was 14. Jake's height chart was on the opposite wall, meticulously updated until he'd topped out at 6 feet. Next to my faded marks, in crooked, childish handwriting, Jake had scrawled, "Emma is taller than me," sometime when we were very young. That was probably the last time he'd ever admitted I was better than him at anything. The door separated more than just the inside from the outside. It separated two realities. In one of them, Emma Sullivan was the dutiful daughter, the reliable sister, the family's emotional support animal and walking ATM. In the other, the one I just stepped into, she was something else entirely. Something undefined. Something free. I took a breath. Then another. The air tasted different out here, cool, clean, carrying the faint earthy scent of autumn leaves from the open window at the end of the hall. The city skyline was melting into twilight beyond the glass, the high-rise windows beginning to blink on one by one, a constellation of other people's lives. I couldn't remember the last time I'd stopped to really look at the city at dusk. Every evening for as long as I could remember, I'd been either hunched over blueprints in the office or sitting at my parents' dinner table, performing the role of the agreeable daughter, too preoccupied with managing everyone else's emotions to notice the sky. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen glowed in the dim hallway. "Marcus Webb, Miss Sullivan, the bank has formally initiated default proceedings. If the full balance isn't paid within 7 business days, the case moves to pre-litigation asset seizure. The collateral property, your parents' house, will likely be scheduled for foreclosure auction. In this state, that process typically takes 4 to 6 months from the initial notice of default, but the notice has already been filed. The auction proceeds will be applied first to the loan balance, penalties, and legal fees. Separately, I've confirmed that you have zero legal liability for any of this debt. You were not a co-borrower or guarantor. The apartment you transferred to your brother is no longer your asset and cannot be reached by creditors seeking to satisfy this particular debt. You're clean." A pause, then a second message. "Congratulations, Emma. You're free. P.S. If your brother's apartment is determined to be his primary residence, homestead exemption laws in this jurisdiction may protect a portion of its equity from certain creditors, but that's a separate matter and entirely not your problem." I stared at the word "free" for a long time. Then, standing there in the empty hallway with the muffled chaos of my former family echoing faintly through the door behind me, I smiled. Not the performance smile. Not the placating smile. Not the mask I'd worn for 20-some years to convince everyone around me that I was fine, that everything was fine, that I was happy to give and give and give until there was nothing left of me but a hollowed-out shell shaped like a good daughter. A real smile. Small and quiet and entirely mine. The kind of smile that comes not from joy exactly, but from relief, the deep, bone-level relief of setting down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying until the moment it was finally gone. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The polished steel doors slid shut, and for a moment I caught my own reflection in the brushed metal, the same face that had stared back at me from the lobby windows 3 months ago, surrounded by pitying colleagues and gloating relatives. But there was something different now. The shadows under my eyes were still there, but the eyes themselves had changed. The perpetual, low-grade anxiety that had always lurked behind my gaze, the constant scanning, the hypervigilance, the desperate search for approval, was gone. In its place was something steady. Something still. Something that looked a lot like peace. Not the fiery, triumphant peace of revenge. Revenge would have brought satisfaction, a climax, and then probably emptiness. What I felt was quieter than that, and far more durable. It was the peace of a frozen river, still on the surface but with a current running deep and powerful underneath, reshaping the landscape in ways no one would see until spring. Outside, the city had gone completely dark. The skyline glittered with a million points of light, each window a story, each story a life being lived by someone who had their own burdens and their own breaking points and their own quiet moments of liberation. The street in front of my building was alive with the red and white streams of evening traffic, headlights and taillights weaving together into a slow, luminous river. I stood on the curb and let the cool air wash over my face. I thought about something my favorite professor had said in my first year of architecture school, a throwaway line in a lecture about foundations that had stuck with me for reasons I'd never fully understood until now. A building is only as strong as what it's built on. You can use the finest materials in the world, the most innovative design, the most beautiful finishes, but if the foundation is compromised, everything above it will eventually crack. The deeper the flaw, the more catastrophic the collapse. For 20-some years, they'd given me a cracked foundation and then blamed me for every fissure in the walls. They told me I was too sensitive, too selfish, too ungrateful, that the house would be fine if I would just try harder to hold it up. And I'd believed them. I'd spent my whole life bracing my shoulders against the ceiling, straining to keep the whole rotten structure from caving in, convinced that if it fell, it would be my fault. But the house was never mine to hold up. It was never built for me. And tonight, I had finally stopped trying to save it. The elevator doors whispered shut behind me. My reflection vanished into the seam of brushed steel, swallowed like a ghost finally laid to rest. I turned left at the corner and walked into the night, my heels clicking steady and even on the pavement, my spine straight, my hands loose at my sides. I didn't look back. I didn't even want to.